2021 started with riots at the U.S. Capitol.
We love you. You're very special.
A new American president was sworn in without crowds.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
America is back.
A new leader in the White House, the tensions in the U.S. China relationship remained.
Vaccines rolled out with the hope that the pandemic would soon end.
I don't know what is in those vaccines.
But people refusing the shots and new variants showed us the war against COVID was far from over.
2021 did see a chaotic end to another war.
And the Taliban retook Afghanistan.
A nation of 1.4 billion people celebrated 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party.
And the world celebrated the Olympics. Tokyo 2020, delayed because of the pandemic.
A busy year in space, China's space station took shape, and tourists boldly went where few civilians have gone before.
And welcome to CGTN's 2021 Year in Review, and what a year it was.
Right, Mike, again, the big story was COVID-19. You know, in 2020, the word of the year was pandemic. This year, it's vaccine.
That's right. And what was once viewed as a silver bullet became politicized. We had to deal with vaccine inequality between rich and poor countries.
And people refusing the vaccines. CGTN's Jim Spellman takes a look back.
The world rang in 2021 on an optimistic note. Despite being in the midst of a brutal wave of COVID-19 infections, vaccines were coming online and going into arms.
Hopefully this will bring a happy 2021 for everybody.
Vaccine rollouts were underway in China, Russia, Israel, the U.S., UK, Europe, and elsewhere. In the United States, new leadership in the White House.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
President Joe Biden came into office vowing to competently address the pandemic after the chaotic Trump era.
Our plan starts with mounting an aggressive, safe, and effective vaccination campaign to meet our goal of administering 100 million shots in our first 100 days in office.
By summer, the Delta variant sparked another deadly global wave of infections.
The Delta variant is well on its way to becoming the dominant variant globally because of its significantly increased transmissibility.
Even as Delta surged, some people resisted government efforts to fight the pandemic. In the U.S., the issue became highly politicized. Demonstrators took to the streets to oppose vaccines, mask mandates, school closures, and other restrictions. Some countries like China, Australia, and New Zealand managed to escape the worst, relying on robust testing, contact tracing, masks, quarantines, and travel limitations. The U.S., UK, Brazil, and Europe have struggled to cope with multiple waves of COVID, as political leaders try to balance public health measures with economic recovery and political blowback. By the end of the summer, cases were falling, but a new problem emerged: waning immunity from vaccines. Some countries began rolling out booster doses. This made vaccine inequity worse, rich countries getting boosters while poor countries wait for first shots.
There's people in the world right now that still don't have access to vaccines. And if we want COVID to end, we have to make sure that everyone has access to vaccines.
As 2021 winds down, yet another new threat emerged.
So today we are announcing B11529 as a variant of concern named Omicron.
It's not yet clear how dangerous the Omicron variant will prove to be, but its emergence has made one thing clear: the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Let's bring in our medical experts. From New York, Dr. William Hazeltine is chair and president of Access Health International. He's also the author of Variants, the Shape-Shifting Challenge of COVID-19, Vaccine Evasion, Reinfection.
Also from New York, Dr. Calvin Sun is an attending physician and clinical assistant professor in emergency medicine.
And Dr. Paula Hedges is a resident on infectious diseases at Vio Cruz, a leading research institute in Rio de Janeiro.
Dr. Calvin Sun, let me start with you. You were here last year when we were talking about COVID-19. In fact, we talked with you on the day you got your vaccine shot. What can you tell us from a doctor's perspective about the difference between 2020 and 2021? Of course, we have more vaccines this year, and we also have more knowledge about the pandemic.
Happy anniversary. Exactly 1 year ago today. Actually, I need to think 2 more hours before I'm exactly 1 year to the moment I got my vaccine. And It has been an amazing year for myself compared to the year before the vaccine, because I've traveled, I've lived, I've laughed, I've cried, tears of joy. I'm living again. I have been living last year, and even with the boosters, I'm even living more so. Unfortunately, we're back in winter, so rates are increasing. So compared to exactly a year ago, before a vaccine, it was like kind of like driving down the highway of life, and there's a massive car pileup from icy conditions, things you can't control for, and we didn't have working seatbelts. I did this for a whole year where I felt like I was in a car accident every day without a seatbelt. And once I got a vaccine exactly a year ago, I finally had a seatbelt. And now we're back into icy conditions. You can't prevent infections in the same way you can't prevent natural disasters, but you can minimize and prevent chances of being hospitalized after a car accident. And now we have working vaccines.
Dr. Hedges, we're talking about the vaccines. You work at an institute that's rather famous there in Brazil, and you're a researcher. Clearly, you've heard these arguments, and I'll throw them out in your direction again. You know, people who say, oh, it takes forever to come up with a vaccine. Magically, this one appears. I don't think it's safe. How do you convince people who still are not getting the jab that it is safe and effective?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here again. So the first point that we need to combine and to understand and to tell people is that the vaccines are not here for this moment, for this past year. The technology behind mRNA and all the other vaccines is being developed by many years, and it's just being coming to our minds right now because it's the moment that we need. But science is working behind us, and every single day behind the scenes by a long time. So what we need to reinforce to people is that they are safe, they are secure, and they are showing the most important thing is that, as mentioned before, the low rates of death, the low rates of hospitalization, and especially right now with these new variants, that we are also kind of safe for these new variants because we are not seeing the rise, especially here in Brazil, we're not seeing the rise of infections at this moment, even with this new Omicron variant coming here at now. But especially that people are safe when they have the complete scheme of vaccines with the booster doses and doing the combination of other kinds of protections to COVID, that they are protected.
Dr. Hazeltine, we have been living with this virus now for almost 2 years. What is your assessment of what we've learned over these last 2 years? Where have you seen the greatest successes in combating the virus and, of course, the worst failures?
Well, we've learned a lot over the last 2 years, but we haven't learned enough. If you actually look at the numbers, we're right now around the world and in many countries as bad or worse than we have ever been in terms of numbers of people infected, in terms of hospitals overflowing. So whatever it was that we should have learned, we haven't learned well enough. We have learned, for example, that this virus is really tricky, that it can change. Some of us, like me, predicted this is exactly what would happen. There would be no herd immunity. The viruses would evolve to evade our immune defenses and our vaccines. And we had to take a series of measures, including public mitigation measures, vaccination of as many people as we can, close to universal vaccination. And we have to really ramp up our efforts to find combinations of new drugs. Some of them, at least one, seems quite promising now, but it's limited. So we have a long, long way to go. I'm afraid we're in for another maybe 3 to 5 years of serious trouble with this virus around the world.
And you say 3 to 5 years, and clearly one of the problems, and we've heard this from WHO officials, is that no one's safe until everyone's safe. And that gets back to this inequality. Some areas of the world where people can get the jabs readily available, other parts where it's been difficult. How do we correct that problem, and how big a problem is that?
It's an enormous problem. And it's not just a problem of the rich countries hoarding the vaccines. It's a problem of vaccine manufacture altogether. Many of us had warned that a pandemic like this was coming and that we needed to prepare. And one of the fundamentals way you prepare for a pandemic like this is you build the capacity in your own country, in your own continent, for vaccine manufacture. And that simply wasn't done. If you look at the South American continent, you may find 5 places that can make vaccines. Africa, it's about the same. We need that capacity. We don't have it, and the world is suffering.
Dr. Hedges, let's continue to talk about vaccine inequality. Of course, you live in Brazil, you work in Brazil, which is a developing country. But if we look at how the vaccines have been distributed around the world over the past year, we've seen that developed countries, richer countries, have got most of the vaccine that's been distributed, and there's still a serious shortage in the developing world. I mean, how does one fix that? And what do you make of efforts like China, for instance, which is trying to export more vaccines to the developing world?
It's critical that big nations and those ones who have enough expertise on providing its infrastructure development, as I also mentioned before, I also agree with Dr. has mentioned that infrastructure development must be a focal point. It's about nations providing, and especially if we talk about China, with all this expertise and the history of successful infrastructure development, we must use this with a variety of implementation of transport, energy, public well-being, capacity building, and developing on those people who will be in the front, who will be like promptly giving the doses, giving the vaccines, that they are well capacitated for doing that. So it's not only about providing vaccines and giving vaccines to the world, but providing the expertise on other nations on how to produce them, how to apply them, and how to have effective public health measures to implement national and security programs of vaccinations. Because what we have seen is that probably it's not the end of booster doses. We're gonna need to have other booster doses for COVID infrequently, maybe in every 5 months, 6 months, 1 year. We don't know this yet, but this is only the beginning. So we need to have this infrastructure in all the countries so they can implement their own programs on vaccines and, of course, minimize the origins of new variants, and new breakdowns that's unfortunately it's coming in our future.
Dr. Hazeltine, you were saying a moment ago that it would be 3 to 5 years that we're going to have to live with this virus, and it's been very frustrating if you listen to people over the last 2 years when they ask that question, when are our lives going to get back to normal? And every time they think they're very close to their lives getting back to what it used to be, there's a variant and it goes back to square one. That we've been told masks you still have to wear, you still got to practice all these mitigation measures, etc. I mean, I'm wondering, in the years ahead, 3 to 5 years, as you say, how are our lives going to change?
Well, I think they're already changing in very substantial ways. But one way they haven't changed in some countries, including my own, is a sense of mutual responsibility. And my responsibility is to take care of my own health, but also be aware that what happens to me affects other people, and what they do affects me. So I'm living in a country where a fair number of people aren't being vaccinated. That means they don't have consideration for others. You need a sense that everybody is in this together, which we are, not just in the world, but in our own country. And so I think that has to be a fundamental change, is respect for one another. I haven't seen it emerge yet. I hope it does, because that is essential before we have the other mitigation measures, before we take our vaccines. And if you heard this, the doctor who's seeing patients who haven't put on their seatbelt, they haven't taken the vaccine. But it's not just they that are getting hurt. It's the other patients who can't get into the hospital and the other people that person has infected. And with Omicron, it's going to be much, much worse. I think we've got to change the way our societies consider what a citizen's job is.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. More than 5.3 million people have died of COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. More than 800,000 of them right here in the United States.
We take a moment now to remember some of the people we lost in 2021.
Communist Party of China turned 100 in 2021.
That story begins our look at some of the top trending stories of the year.
President and General Secretary Xi Jinping highlighted a century of leadership by the party that turned China into a moderately prosperous society. And he called on the next generation to carry on the legacy.
The July 1st celebration set the stage for an historical resolution passed by the ruling Communist Party in November, only the third in 100 years of the CPC. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era now joins Mao Zedong's thought and Deng Xiaoping's theory.
In the United States, the year started with political upheaval. Donald Trump supporters breached the halls of Congress on January 6th. They, like the former president, wanted to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election victory. The deadly insurrection ravaged the Capitol building.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
But it didn't prevent Biden's inauguration, January 20th.
Civilian-led governments fell to the military in Myanmar and Sudan. The February 1st arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi led to a highly criticized trial. She was convicted for inciting dissent against the military and breaking restrictions during a deadly COVID-19 outbreak in Myanmar.
Sudan's hopes for a civilian government rose and fell, and rose again at the end of the year. The October 25th military takeover sparked widespread protests and a deadly crackdown. Ultimately, the top general appointed himself leader in a power-sharing deal and invited back the deposed prime minister.
In Afghanistan, 20 years of war ends with the Taliban back in control. Kabul fell on August 15th. 10 days later, U.S. troops and their stunned NATO allies staged a chaotic and deadly withdrawal.
When the U.S. ended its 20-year war in Afghanistan, it came with major criticism of President Joe Biden.
Polls showed that most Americans supported the decision to pull troops from the country, but the majority disapproved of the way it was done.
To discuss global politics in 2021, let's bring in another panel of experts. Here in Washington, D.C., Jonathan Broder is a contributing editor at Congressional Quarterly.
From Brussels, Shada Islam is the managing director of global advisory company New Horizons Project.
And Einar Tangen is a current affairs commentator joining us from Beijing. Jonathan, of course, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was chaotic. There was a lot of criticism, and really the country still remains in shambles. How much of a black eye has this been for President Biden?
It's been a pretty big black eye. I mean, there are basically two approaches to how bad of a black eye it is. I don't think anyone disagrees that the chaos and the frantic nature of the withdrawal wasn't what everybody saw on their television screens. The question is how much damage it's going to be doing to the United States in the long run.
All right, let's go to Brussels to Shada Islam. Shada, great to have you with us. You know, when President Biden took office, he promised to get the United States back on the international arena, back on the international stage. But when we look at the Afghanistan episode and the lack of coordination with the United States, European partners, I mean, how do you see that? Did it feel a little bit like the old Trump years with America First?
Absolutely, it did. It felt just like America First all over again. And there was an enormous amount of disappointment and shock across the European Union. The EU was not consulted. There was no coordination. There was no pre-warning on how America was going to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan. And of course, NATO was involved as well. The EU was left on the sidelines. This has been a wake-up call. And of course, the EU, as you know, is pushing ahead with some of its strategic autonomy conversations to try and sort of wean itself off the dependency on the United States, especially for security.
Einar, I want to draw you into the conversation, get your thoughts on the withdrawal. And what does it mean for regional geopolitics, do you think?
Well, I mean, the first and foremost, it calls into question the reliability of the United States. I mean, this is not seen in isolation. It goes beyond AUKUS. It goes to the fact that the U.S., depending on who is in power, Republican or Democrat, withdraws from major treaties, especially those involving the environment, both Kyoto and the Paris Accords. And also, exactly what does the U.S. bring to these kind of regional areas? I mean, right now, if you're making a kind of arm's length assessment of where the U.S. has been and what influence it has not been productive. I mean, Afghanistan is not only broke, it is bankrupt and also abandoned. 2/3 of its people are facing starvation. And you start looking at other areas, Iraq, Yemen, all of these areas. And it really brings to mind that this is not a time when you want the U.S. in your backyard. So it begs the question, as the U.S. moves into Asia, whether they're going to have the kind of same, quote, successes, unquote, that they've had in the Middle East.
Einar, I want to get back to something you said earlier where Afghanistan is broke. You have people starving there. It's also broken. And international aid vanished when the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. What should the international community be doing right now, especially when you consider that the winter months are there, they're having trouble with electricity, you can just see this new variant of COVID perhaps just taking off in the country. I mean, it's really a recipe for disaster.
Well, yes. I mean, there are 80,000 fighters who, on the Taliban side. They're now trying to wrestle control over a 3 million person government, and it's not going well. They don't have the money. Right now, the chief culprit is unfortunately the United States. There's $10 billion that belongs to Afghanistan that is not being released. That money is desperately needed. And this is a humanitarian crisis. You can talk about the politics all you want, whether you like or dislike the Taliban. I don't think anybody wants to see the kind of humanitarian crisis that is now unfolding.
Shada Islam, another point of contention between the United States and its European allies, as well as China, is the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, as it's known. President Biden, of course, was a member of the administration, a senior member of the administration that signed the initial deal a few years back. But now his administration seems to be dragging its feet, and every day there are threats issued against Iran. How is it seen in Europe? What would Europe like to see?
Well, the Iranian deal is very much a kind of feather in the hat for the European Union, or at least the E3, Germany, France, and the UK. But obviously, the European Union institutions have been involved. And so they've been trying desperately throughout the last few years. I mean, under Trump, of course, that was absolutely impossible. No headway was made. Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. And now there have been discussions in Vienna. The EU delegation went to Tehran as well, hoping against hope that things would get back to normal. But of course, you have now another government in Tehran, a more hardline government. And the EU feeling now is that the demands coming from the Iranian side are unacceptable. So there's a great deal of disappointment that, things have come so far and that hopes of getting this nuclear agreement have now been shattered. But I think there's still hope there yet. I think everyone needs to sort of take a step back and reflect a little bit on how to go forward. Europe is determined, I think, to get a deal, but it can't do it alone. It needs Joe Biden's administration on its side, and of course, it needs Tehran to reciprocate.
With Biden at the White House, analysts expected a better China-U.S. relationship, but 2021 has been a rocky road. CGTN's Nathan King takes us through that path.
Warm words between the leaders of the two biggest economies as President Xi and President Biden began their November virtual summit.
We should each run our domestic affairs well and at the same time shoulder our share of international responsibilities and work together to advance the noble cause of world peace and development. This is the shared desire of the people of our two countries and around the world, and the joint mission of Chinese and American leaders.
But 2021 was not a warm one in U.S.-China relations. The first high-level meeting with the new Biden administration and their Chinese counterparts was held in the frozen northern state of Alaska in March. the conversation was equally cool. Beijing was frustrated that the Biden administration essentially continued the confrontational policies of the Trump administration on trade, tariffs, sanctions over human rights, and excluding Chinese technologies. There was also problems with the deeper engagement with Taiwan by the U.S., and unlike the Trump administration, putting pressure on allies in Asia and Europe to join what Beijing views as the containment of China's rise.
Warships of the United States have repeatedly flaunted their strength and provoked troubles in the Taiwan Strait recently in the disguise of free navigation. This is not a promise of freedom and openness, but a deliberate interference and destruction of regional peace and stability. This is clear and obvious to the international community.
But underneath these growing tensions, there's also an awareness that Washington and Beijing need to cooperate in areas that affect the whole planet, like climate change. Coordinated actions to increase global oil supplies, supply chains, and tackling global inflation showed what the two powers can do when they cooperate. And stability in Afghanistan, on the Korean Peninsula, and with Iran are also areas where Beijing and Washington are cooperating out of mutual self-interest. Washington continues to frame relations as strategic competition. Beijing sees it more like strategic confrontation. But continued COVID problems in the U.S. and supply chain bottlenecks, coupled with rising inflation, could lead to reductions in tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports in 2022. But Beijing and other powers are also increasingly concerned about Washington's efforts to introduce an ideological component into relations with China and others. The recent so-called Summit for Democracy was a hand-picked invitation of like-minded other powers. And fears are that dividing the world into two different ideological camps could reduce the chances of cooperation in the future. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke, spoke with us on our daily talk show, The Heat, about the virtual summit between Presidents Xi and Biden and the importance of the two countries working together.
Even though there were no agreements coming out of this particular summit, virtual summit, it was the beginning stage, the necessary first step to working on these other issues, whether it's issues of difference and contention or issues of common interest, such as climate change. Our differences must not be allowed to devolve into conflict, because the world suffers if there's any type of military conflict between our two nations. And it's certainly would be devastating to China and devastating to the United States if we had any type of military conflict. So the challenge is to enable this competition on a fair, equal basis, on a level playing field, but also moving forward on issues of great interest and consequence, not just to China, not just to the United States, but the entire world. So the world is looking for aggressive progress and leadership from the United States and China working together on so many of these issues.
Jonathan, let's talk about tensions and going forward. It's described as the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Of course, the relationship between the United States and China. That relationship very rocky under the Trump administration, still very confrontational under the Biden administration. How do you view it?
Well, one diplomat said to me that he described the relationship between the United States and China as America first with better manners. The United States has increased its contacts with Taiwan, which has angered the Chinese. And the Chinese president, at one point during the discussion, warned President Biden that the more he talked about commitments to protecting Taiwan, to the whole sort of raising the issue of a possible Chinese attempt to take over Taiwan by force, that all of this was what he called playing with fire, and those who play with fire get burnt. And I thought it was very, very interesting that a couple days later, Biden was asked about this conversation, and the first thing he emphasized was the United States does not support independence for Taiwan, which was made clear to him in that conversation with President Xi that that is the red line. So it sounds to me that, at least for now, so far, Biden has gotten the message.
Anna Tangen, looking back this year, you know, we had 4 years, of course, of the tumultuous Trump presidency. But looking back over this year, did Beijing expect a better relationship with President Biden and the United States? I mean, how does Beijing view that relationship now?
Well, I think at the time it was described as it's, how do you want to die? You know, with a shot, bullet to the head or poison. Biden was not seen as anybody who was going to necessarily change the course. They predicted that he would, in fact, say, rather than the U.S. going it alone, as Donald Trump did, that he was going to get a like-minded group of democracies to gang up on China, and that has been the case. I think there was some surprise that he would have they expected that he would have gotten rid of the tariffs, since he campaigned on that. He said that they were a bad idea. He knows that they're a burden on the American public more than on China. But throughout this entire thread, if you start looking at it, it seems that today domestic politics is really the driver of everything that's happening internationally, and unfortunately, it's in this downward spiral. Where the United States government, parts of it, especially the CIA, NSA, is pushing a very negative narrative against China, and that is reflected in the press, and that then becomes policy because the elected officials want to amplify and reflect these negative issues. So it's just going further downwards, not upwards.
Shada, I liked Jonathan Broder's comment, America first, but with better manners. Obviously, Europe ends up a lot of times feeling like they're in the middle and getting squeezed to take sides. Is that the case right now, and how do they finesse that?
Well, yes, caught between a rock and a hard place, definitely. Being very careful, I have to say, to not to fall into this binary trap. So Washington, of course, is, consultations have taken place just recently between U.S. and EU officials. There's a lot of to and fro, lots of talk about, having a united front vis-a-vis China, working together on trade issues, on Taiwan. Declarations come out, joint statements and all the rest of it. But the EU is also determined to have its strategic autonomy on this question and remains committed to a three-track approach towards China, which is looking at China as a partner, a competitor, and a rival. There are nuances and differences within the 27 EU countries, but the overall line is we're not going to fall into this binary trap. We're going to have our own policy. What Josep Borrell, the EU representative, has said, we're going to do things our way. He calls it the Sinatra Doctrine, by the way.
Einer, about a decade ago, I remember coming to work here. One of the biggest stories that we covered when we first went on the air was, of course, at the time, the Vice President of China, Xi Jinping, coming to Washington, D.C., and meeting with the Vice President at that time, Joe Biden. So these two leaders know each other. They also recognize that cooperation is vital on some of these big issues like climate change, combating the pandemic. Where do they find the common ground? And of course, we've covered the Sunnyland Summit between Obama and Xi, and Xi coming to Mar-a-Lago. Can we expect more face-to-face summits in the near future, do you think?
Well, I think it would be good for both sides to have this. Unfortunately, right now, as I said before, almost everything that Biden is doing is dictated by domestic politics. He feels he has to give a sop whenever, all the time to the Republicans so that they don't use it against him in the midterms. And that sop is generally China, taking action against it, both in terms of military, where they're building up and selling more arms to Taiwan, criticism of China constantly, that China is somehow guilty of genocide in Xinjiang. And, economically, where these tariffs go on and you continue to see this litany of blacklisted companies that the U.S. said is our security threat without actually producing any proof. So, there has to be some sort of break in this cycle. Unfortunately, historically, It takes either a very, very large crisis or real statesmanship. And at this point, you really don't see that happening, especially on the U.S. side. Everyone stresses that there's got to be an accommodation, that they have to work together. But if my desire is to kill you off, it's not really a good starting point. This is not the prisoner's dilemma, where it's two parties who believe they have to get along. The U.S., in its heart of hearts, believes that its system is right, that China's system is wrong, and that it has to contain it, and that is the problem.
Well, I want to thank you for your insights, and thanks to all of our panelists. We're going to have to leave it right there.
Political polarization was on full display in Latin America.
5 countries voted for president this year. As CGTN's Dan Collins tells us, these elections pitted the left and the right against one another and posed challenges to the old guard.
It's a turbulent moment in Latin American politics as the region recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. This past year, there were presidential elections in Peru, Chile, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Ecuador, in a deeply polarized political landscape. As 2021 draws to a close, there are 4 new presidents in Latin America. With the exception of Nicaragua's election, voters mostly voted out incumbents and mostly voted left. On December 19th, Chile elected Gabriel Boric, a leftist former student leader who, at 35 years of age, is the country's youngest ever president.
I will do my best to live up to the trust you've placed in me. We do not forget justice, truth, respect.
He will replace outgoing Sebastián Piñera, one of Chile's richest men and part of the country's right-wing elite. In neighboring Peru, leftist former rural schoolteacher Pedro Castillo won the presidential election in June, though not by such a convincing margin. Castillo, who pledged there would be, quote, no more poor people in a rich country, beat his right-wing rival Keiko Fujimori by a fraction of a percentage point. While he survived his first impeachment attempt in Peru's notoriously unstable political scene, he's also made errors and lost support, and analysts say he may not be so lucky next time. In Ecuador, conservative former banker Guillermo Lasso beat his nominally leftist rival Andrés Arauz to take office in May. Initially high approval ratings due to an ambitious coronavirus vaccination campaign have been dented by rising insecurity and crime. Honduras's first ever female president-to-be, Xiomara Castro, vowed to combat drugs gangs when she was elected earlier this month.
Fueran los escuadrones de la muerte. Out with the death squads, out with corruption, out with the drug trafficking and organized crime. No more poverty and misery. To victory. The people are always united. Together, we're going to transform this country.
Also in Central America, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega secured a 4th term. Most countries in the region and the Organization of American States have refused to recognize the legitimacy of the vote, with the notable exceptions of Bolivia, Venezuela and Cuba. Nicaragua has since declared its intention to withdraw from the OAS. Other countries expressed concern over the jailing of political opponents, the blocking of competing political parties, and the silencing of the independent media. Days after the vote, Nicaragua broke ties with Taiwan and resumed diplomatic relations with China. Dan Collins, CGTN, Lima.
There's no doubt about it, the pandemic dominated headlines again this year. Yet, on social media, people were often distracted and delighted by other stories, many offering fascinating glimpses into our changing world.
CGTN's Gerald Tan scoured the digital sphere to get the gist on the most popular stories of 2021.
The internet versus Wall Street, animals minding their own business, and the rich riding rockets like ordinary folk taking the bus. What was most liked, most shared, and most trending in 2021? Here's the gist. We appear to be in a new space race. No, not among nations, but billionaires. First, Richard Branson blasted off in a vessel that he funded. A week later, Jeff Bezos took a trip to subspace in a different vehicle developed by his company. And while Silicon Valley focused on space tourism, China had its eye on science. The Tiangong space station is zooming towards completion after the successful launch of Tianhe, the main module of the orbiting laboratory. This year, we learned all about non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, from memes such as Neon Cat to the illustrations by musician Grimes and a record-shattering $69 million artwork. These digital assets that trade like cryptocurrency are part of the rise in virtual goods. Now remember GameStop? Hedge funds were betting on the company's decline, but internet traders banded together to hold the shares and not sell, driving the stock price to meteoric high, at its peak up more than 2,000%. The internet makes people invest, and it also makes people cook. TikTok pasta became a hit. Cherry tomatoes, garlic, feta cheese and pasta. A dish so viral and fat-filled, it sent web users into a binary cardiac arrest. And if you want to know what was the must-watch program of the year, look no further than Squid Game, the Netflix sensation about a fictitious Korean reality competition brought new meaning to child's play, while inspiring thousands of memes and Halloween costumes. For months, people were in awe at the herd of elephants making a mammoth trek across China's Yunnan province. CCTV footage of the giant mammals wandering the streets garnered clicks and inspired community action to help them head home to the natural reserve. Other animals also made a splash on CGTN's digital media. Among the 5 most watched videos, a chimpanzee in China aping its way to mask wearing, a wild boar in Vietnam with mega public appeal, and a rampaging bull in India. And finally, China's cultural ambassador extraordinaire, the giant panda. One in particular got special attention this year. Xiao Qiji turned 1, a superstar born during the pandemic in the Smithsonian's National Zoo in Washington, with more fans than bamboo shoots he can consume in a lifetime. So there you have it, the stories that made dinner table conversation, that made us stop and say, huh, the ones that made 2021 quite simply unforgettable. And now you have the gist.
Let's take a look at more top trending stories of 2021.
One of the biggest events of the year, the Tokyo Olympics, was supposed to happen in 2020. Tokyo delayed the Summer Games because of COVID-19. The scaled-back competition happened largely in a bubble, stepped-up testing, and smaller crowds to cheer on the athletes. The U.S., China, and host nation Japan took home the most medals.
At the Games, Simone Biles showed it was okay to not be okay. The star gymnast shone the spotlight on mental health. She sat out most of her events as she dealt with the twisties, a performance disorientation, then a loss of a family member, and a massive sex abuse scandal. A team doctor was convicted, and USA Gymnastics and the Olympic Committee agreed to pay $380 million to survivors.
Colonial Pipeline paid out nearly $4.5 million in one of the biggest ransomware attacks of the year. The April breach disrupted gas supplies up and down the United States East Coast. A month later, meat processing JBS Foods paid $11 million after an attack on its U.S. and Australian operations. It's one of the largest ever ransomware payouts.
Haiti spiraled deeper into chaos. President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated in July. Another devastating earthquake struck in August. Foreign missionaries were kidnapped in October, the most high-profile in a rash of gang abductions. And dozens died in December when a fuel truck crashed, then exploded as residents tried to collect its contents. Gas is in short supply because gangs are blocking deliveries.
And a rare December tornado outbreak devastated 5 U.S. states. Nearly 100 people died, most of them in Kentucky. 100 more were still reported missing a week after the disaster. It's believed a single tornado traveled 365 kilometers, the longest on record. It flattened everything in its path, including a candle factory in Kentucky and an Amazon warehouse in Illinois. Both had workers inside at the time.
This year saw a range of natural disasters, snowstorms and heavy rains in Europe, sandstorms in China, wildfires in the United States, deforestation in the Amazon.
The rainforest is critical in balancing the planet's climate. While some logging has slowed, environmentalists say it's not enough. We sent our correspondent Paula Cabral to the Amazon region.
This room in Brazil's National Space Research Institute, INPE, is where satellites deployed to, among other things, measure deforestation in the Amazon jungle are monitored. Environmentalists say there is no doubt that destruction continues and that any reduction seen over the last few months signals a pause, at best, that's not the result of government action.
Não, se existe alguma redução nos números de desmatamento.
If there is any reduction in deforestation figures, and we will only know for sure in the future, this would have mostly to do with the appetite of deforesters to invest more or invest less in clearing the forests at a given moment. This has nothing to do with government action because the administration is not where it should be in the Amazon, and when they are somewhere, they are promoting the wrong policies.
The Amazon is the world's largest rainforest, and it serves a key environmental function in balancing the planet's climate due to its capacity to absorb CO2, carbon dioxide. But there are major fears over its long-term survival, and this road, the BR 319, is, according to environmentalists, a major threat to the region. There is a government project to pave long stretches of this highway, which is still made in large part of dirt roads, which become often impassable during the rainy season. The idea is hailed by farmers, loggers, gold miners and cattle ranchers as an important step in developing this region, while environmentalists see it as a major threat to the rainforest, as it's likely to speed up deforestation along with the rise in economic activity.
What Bolsonaro's administration and some representatives of the government promised when they went to the COP26, they said they signed the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, and also they said that Brazil will reduce emissions, and all of that we see as something that lack ambition and something that the actions needed to reach those goals, they won't come from this government.
The government of President Jair Bolsonaro, under pressure at home and abroad, say actions are being taken to protect the Amazon. But despite some small indications of recent improvement, the figures do not show any significant changes in the scale of destruction. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Humaitá, in the Brazilian Amazon.
To talk about the preservation of our planet, we have Chunghwa Wu. She is CEO of Beijing Future Innovative Center, and she's joining us from Arlington, Virginia.
And from Iceland, Halldór Johansson is the Executive Director of the Arctic Portal. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Halldór, let me start with you. Of course, the big event of 2021 as far as climate change is concerned was the COP26 conference, which was held in Glasgow, Scotland. We heard a lot of promises being made, a lot of pledges being made. What is your assessment of COP26 and what it's achieved?
I agree with Secretary General Guterres when he stated that there were important steps made, but maybe not enough. He also stated that we have some building blocks for progress, and I do agree because, as I've stated before, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So it was an important gathering of many of the most important players when it comes to climate change and fighting climate change and adapting to climate change. But definitely we didn't get to an end conclusion, of course. But it was a good start, I believe.
Chunghwa, he's talking about the major players. Obviously, China is one of those major players in taking climate very seriously. And here at CGTN, we are as well. We had the Global Action Initiative. We had 5 special programs hitting on that theme. We also heard from the ambassador from China to the United States, Qin Gong, speaking on the issue. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Chinese leaders attach great importance to climate change. As early as 16 years ago, President Xi Jinping famously said, "Green mountains are gold mountains and silver mountains." In September last year, President Xi announced that China aims to have CO2 emission peak before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. Recently, China introduced a working guidance and an action plan in this field. This fully demonstrates China's commitment to addressing climate change as a major country.
Chung-Hwa, what do you make of these goals?
Well, I think China, as the world's largest CO2 emitter, is definitely moving forward in terms of its commitment. It's not just a political will. The whole country has pretty much worked out more detailed time-bound targets, goals, and action plans in order to really deploy decarbonization and the transition towards carbon neutrality, of course, capping emissions before the end of this decade and the carbon neutrality before 2060. So compared to a lot of noises and or debates actually demonstrated at the Glasgow process, China stands more solidly on the action side.
Chung-Hwa, of course, the other big environment event that took place in 2021 was the COP15 conference, which took place in the Chinese city of Kunming. And we remember it coincided with that huge herd of elephants that was crossing China at the time. They passed very close to Kunming, as our reporter Gerald Tant showed us a moment ago. But looking at the conference itself on biodiversity, how important was it to focus attention on this?
It's very critical. It's a very critical foundational life support system for humanity, of course, to survive, because nature provides food, services, water, everything actually for human as a species actually to survive and existence. So yes, I'm delighted to see the Asian elephant has been actually put more like a symbolic, image into representing the sense of urgency of biodiversity conservation. But in the meantime, also demonstrating the endeavors and achievements so far, and particularly from China perspective, in terms of laying out the ecological red lines, protecting nature, different ecosystems there. So I'm hoping somehow the two COPs coming together pretty much set the tone and the sense of urgency, and as well as the direction for the global community to work with each other to really address fundamentally the ecological red lines or limits or constraints for human development.
Haldor, I know your work in the Arctic. This is a very serious matter to you and most of the people you know, and yet there still are climate skeptics out there. We saw so many extreme weather events this year. Do you think that's enough to convince them that we're facing a really serious problem here?
I hope so, but at the same time, I'm not convinced. You asked the question about the Arctic, and unfortunately, there was not a lot of discussion about the Arctic. There was there was an iceberg from Greenland, and people could see firsthand how quickly it melted, even though it was, let's say, fall temperatures in Glasgow. We definitely need more understanding. We definitely need more data and information out there so that people can understand. I think some of the pledges made in Glasgow are favorable to the Arctic. This includes the pledge of financing mechanisms to consider climate change and ecology as a very important factor in their financing mechanisms. This also deals with the deforestation, because of course that's very important to the Arctic, to maintain the forests in the Arctic. I was recently in Kamchatka in Russia, and because our colleague was just talking about biodiversity, these regions, they link together because the birds that migrate into the Arctic and down to China, back and forth, they go through these very important regions like Kamchatka, for example. And there, of course, the big question for people is how can we survive? And we definitely need to link all these different factors together so that we can build one world. And definitely the Arctic is a very important part of that, because what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, as so commonly phrased nowadays.
Haldor, over the past years, many countries told us about their plans or their benchmarks that they've set up for themselves in the battle against climate change. We heard from China. China told us that it hopes to peak emissions by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060. But of course, every long journey begins with the first step. What do you expect to happen in the year ahead, in 2022?
Well, I hope we can increase the collaboration and cooperation. I was very happy in Glasgow to hear the announcement made by the USA and China about boosting collaboration, because these are the two big players now, and of course, both those countries need to take leadership, and they need to show precedence for the rest of us to follow. Because even though every little step matters, it's very important that those two megapowers work together and line up to support all of us to take the necessary steps. I hope to see more advances in renewable energy. There have been some incredible developments in China, for example, in the car industry, and I really hope to see those advance. And I also hope that governments take mechanisms to support the general public in adapting to those changes by, for example, lowering prices of electrical cars. I had an interesting talk with a taxi driver in Glasgow, and his big concern was that prices would go up and he would not be able to, for example, buy an electrical taxi to drive in the streets of Glasgow. I think that's just a small example of how we need to link the big to the small.
Chung-Hwa, to kind of piggyback off what Haldor was just talking about, electric vehicles, we are seeing countries making moves saying, look, at some point we're going to outlaw the combustible engine. Everybody's going to be in electric vehicles, and that's a good thing. But here in the United States and China, we still know that there's a lot of coal-fired power plants, and the electricity is coming from those plants, which is a bad thing. How do we rectify that?
It's a tough situation. It's a complicated situation. Assume we're going to address climate change issues, let's all reduce carbon emissions and drive that down to near zero, if we possible, within time bounds or whatever the commitment. That'd be wonderful. But in order to deliver such a kind of ambition, we all know it involves technology, it involves industrial policy, industrial landscape. It involves the finance, involves talents there as well. Particular supply chain as well. So you're starting to see all those constraining or distracting factors coming together when we look into the landscape of delivery. I think that's where I think the world today is stuck, right? If you look at the countries, particularly leading economies like U.S, China, EU, among others, we're all building up the guardrails in the name of national security. So on one side, we say we're going to work with each other to address global climate change challenges. In reality, the mainstream, the mindset is still pretty much stuck in the sort of a zero-sum game, momentum. That's really delaying the actions and, to a large extent, wasting resources, both the national industrial resources there, to block us, hold us back to deliver. Which is really unfortunate. Yes, U.S. China agreed to work with each other, but then if you look at the reality, we're pretty much, doing that on our own. And so I think that there's a major problem or issue on the table that need to be addressed.
Chung-Hwa, Haldor, thank you both for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
2021 is coming to an end, and we have plenty of things to look forward to in 2022.
That's right. Important elections will take place in countries like Brazil, France, the Philippines, Colombia, and South Korea.
Qatar will host the FIFA World Cup. To escape the desert heat, footballers will play in November and December.
China will host the Winter Olympics in February. Beijing will become the first city in the world to host both the Winter and Summer Games.
In 2022, China will complete its space station. A very exciting year is coming up. And with vaccines and new treatments, the coronavirus pandemic might become a thing of the past, or at least manageable.
And to keep you from feeling blue, Pantone picked Very Perry as 2022's color of the year. According to the company, this purplish shade represents inventiveness.
So let's reinvent in 2022. We hope next year will be memorable for the right reasons. I'm Anand Naidu.
And I'm Mike Walter. Thanks so much for watching.